Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Thanksgiving dinner had always been a performance in our family, a yearly ritual soaked in forced smiles, clinking glasses, and barely disguised tension simmering just beneath the surface of polished silverware and overpriced entrees. This year was no exception, and as I stepped into the high-end restaurant my mother had so proudly chosen, I braced myself for the usual parade of small talk, thinly veiled jabs, and the inevitable moment when someone would make me feel like I was lucky just to have a seat at the table. The restaurant was one of those places with dim lighting, velvet booths, and staff trained to treat their guests like royalty as long as the tip promised to match the ambience. My heels clicked against the marble floor as the hostess led me to the private dining room my mother had reserved, a room I knew full well she only felt comfortable reserving because she assumed I'd be the one footing the bill again, just like every other year. Everyone was already seated when I arrived. My mother Judy in her usual prim blazer, my sister Lena dressed in something gauzy and floral that made her look like she floated instead of walked, and Tom, Lena's husband, who had already ordered a whiskey and was pretending to care about the wine list. A few cousins, an aunt or two, and even Uncle Don had made the cut this year, which meant I could expect at least 3 off-color jokes and one uncomfortable story before the breadbasket even made it to the table. I smiled and greeted them all warmly, kissed cheeks, exchanged hollow pleasantries, and took my usual seat at the far end of the table, closest to the window, where the city lights blurred like watercolor beyond the glass. I tried to be gracious, as I always did. I complimented my mother on her choice of venue, asked Lena about her latest side project, which, unsurprisingly, was another Etsy shop she'd started but hadn't stocked, and even offered to help the server take drink orders when everyone else acted like it was beneath them. It was muscle memory by now, this smiling, accommodating version of me that only seemed to surface at family gatherings. The version that made everything easier for everyone else. The version that didn't ask for anything in return. Halfway through appetizers, my phone buzzed quietly in my clutch, and I excused myself to take the call in the hallway. It wasn't important, just a colleague wishing me a happy holiday, but I welcomed the brief moment of silence away from the chaos of the dining room. I stood near the entrance, facing the wall, politely ending the call when I heard my name mentioned in that sharp, clipped tone my mother always used when she thought she was being discreet but secretly wanted to be heard. "She's only here because she always pays the bill," she said, her voice carrying just loud enough that it could be passed off as a whisper if anyone chose to pretend they hadn't heard it. Honestly, I didn't even want to invite her, but you know how awkward it would have been not to. And with a place like this, we can't afford to cover it on our own. She expects it now anyway, it's just what she does. Lena made a noise I couldn't quite place, maybe a hum of agreement or just nervous laughter, but the damage had already been done. I stood there, motionless, the warmth in my chest evaporating and replaced by something cold and hollow. I had always suspected that my presence at these gatherings was more about convenience than affection, but hearing it confirmed so bluntly still took the air out of my lungs. I had paid for every holiday dinner for the last 7 years, every birthday brunch, every brunch for no reason that Judy insisted on hosting in overpriced restaurants she'd never set foot in otherwise. And not once, not one single time, had anyone thanked me without it sounding like a formality or a transaction. I didn't react right away. I didn't storm back in or throw a scene or let the moment twist my face into something bitter. Instead, I breathed slowly, squared my shoulders, and walked calmly back to the table as if I hadn't just heard my mother reduce my worth to a line item on a restaurant invoice. I sat down, picked up my napkin, and continued listening to Uncle Don's half-finished story about a car that caught fire in a grocery store parking lot, laughing in the right places, nodding when appropriate. But something in me had shifted, some final thread had snapped so quietly I almost didn't notice it at first. Maybe it was the years of quiet tolerance finally rising to the surface, or maybe it was the stark clarity that comes when you stop hoping people will change and start realizing you don't have to keep paying for the illusion of love. I waited until the main courses arrived, until everyone had filled their plates and filled their glasses again, until the conversation had grown loud and careless. And then, while Judy was talking about how overcooked her lamb was and Tom was asking the server about dessert options, I set my fork down gently, wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, and stood up slowly. I raised my glass, not in a toast, not in celebration, but simply as a signal for attention. "You know what?" I said, smiling as every head turned toward me, faces full of expectation. "I think I just had a change of heart." And then I sat back down. And the silence that followed was deafening. There's a peculiar kind of ache that builds slowly over the years, not from one sudden injury, but from the repeated, quiet bruises you learn to ignore just to keep the peace. It's not the kind of pain that leaves scars anyone can see. It's the kind that settles in your chest, in your stomach, in the spaces between your ribs where the words you never said have been hiding for decades. As I sat there in that restaurant, the clinking of utensils and the low hum of conversation surrounding me, my mind drifted far from the table and straight into the long hallway of memories I'd tried to keep shut behind me. I could see them so clearly now, those other Thanksgiving dinners over the years, always at some overpriced restaurant my mother chose under the guise of tradition, though it was never a tradition anyone else asked for. I'd arrive with a smile, dressed just right, carrying the weight of work and responsibility behind a carefully painted face, and they'd greet me with perfunctory hugs, lukewarm compliments, and just enough sugar in their voices to make their bitterness pass for politeness. Judy would always pick the restaurant without asking, Lena would always conveniently forget her wallet, and Tom would always order the most expensive scotch on the menu while making loud, condescending jokes that no one dared challenge. I remember one Thanksgiving when I had just closed a major deal at work, one that had taken me months of sleepless nights and relentless meetings, and I'd thought, foolishly, that maybe someone would ask how I was doing, just once. Instead, Judy spent the entire evening praising Lena for taking up painting again, even though her canvases were still sitting untouched in the basement. At the end of the night, when the check came, everyone just looked at me, without a word, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I paid, smiled, and told myself it didn't matter, that I was happy to do it, that family meant sacrifice, that maybe next time would be different. But next time was never different. Each year, it got easier for them to expect and harder for me to pretend it didn't bother me. They stopped saying thank you altogether at some point, like my generosity had shifted from kindness to obligation, as though I'd signed some invisible contract the day I made my first real paycheck. The most I ever got was a dismissive, "Well, Rachel's doing well, she can afford it," said with that smug tone that always managed to make success sound like a character flaw. And the insults, though rarely direct, were always sharp enough to leave a sting. "Maybe if you had a husband, you wouldn't have to work so much," my mother once said with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Or, "You're just too independent for your own good," delivered with a smile from Lena as she accepted another gift she'd never thank me for. Every comment wrapped in concern, every jab disguised as humor, every dismissal framed as affection. Have you ever paid the price just to be accepted by people who don't even appreciate you? Have you ever picked up the check, not because you wanted to show off or play the hero, but because it was the only way you felt invited in the first place? I want to hear your stories, honestly, I do. Drop them in the comments. I promise I'll read everyone. Maybe we've all been the silent payer at someone else's table, hoping the cost would buy us something it never truly could. As I came back to the present, the voices at the table still droned on around me, Judy now critiquing the portion sizes while Lena scrolled through her phone and Tom made some joke about how he'd have to sell a kidney to afford dessert. None of them noticed the shift in my posture, the way I reached into my purse with quiet purpose, fingers curling around my wallet not with resignation, but with a newfound clarity. I pulled out my card slowly, not to hand it over, but to press it gently between my fingers, a symbol of how much power I had always held without realizing it. I looked around the table one more time, watching them laugh and sip and indulge without a second thought, and I knew this was the last time I'd ever let my kindness be mistaken for servitude. Then, I raised my hand slightly and caught the waiter's eye from across the room. And just like that, everything began to shift. There's something oddly satisfying about the sound of a waiter's shoes clicking softly across a polished floor when you know he's about to deliver a message that will shift the entire balance of power in a room. As he made his way toward our table, notepad in hand, his professional expression unreadable but calm, I could feel the shift in energy ripple before anyone else noticed. I watched him quietly as he stopped at the end of the table, just behind my mother's chair, and asked in that perfectly neutral, trained for high-end service tone, "Will this be one check or separate checks this evening?" For a second, no one answered. The silence was thick and clumsy, and then came the first awkward glance, the flicker of confusion flashing across my mother's face like a storm cloud on a sunny afternoon. She turned slowly toward me, her lips parting, but before she could speak, Lena leaned toward her and whispered, not quite quietly enough, "Is this a joke?" "She's kidding, right?" I smiled then. Not a vindictive grin or a sarcastic smirk, but a small, serene kind of smile, the kind you wear when you've finally decided that enough is enough, and the cost of pretending no longer outweighs the freedom of finally speaking the truth. I folded my napkin neatly and laid it on the table beside my plate, then took a small sip of my wine before answering, my voice light but unshakably clear. "No joke," I said, letting my eyes move slowly around the table, catching each confused, annoyed, and slightly alarmed expression. "I've decided to donate this year's family dinner fund to a shelter downtown." It seemed like a better use of money than this. You could almost hear the collective gasp as the words landed. Tom choked slightly on his drink, Judy blinked like she had just been slapped with a cold cloth, and Lena's face twisted into something between disbelief and dismay. The waiter stood patiently, glancing around the table like a man watching a play unfold from center stage, waiting for his cue to write down whatever chaos came next. "I don't understand," my mother said, her voice higher than usual, the edges of her tone already starting to fray. "What do you mean donate the dinner fund? What fund?" I shrugged gently, tilting my head just slightly. "You know, the unspoken agreement where I pay for everything, and you all pretend it's normal while making comments behind my back about how it's expected. That fund. I thought it could be better spent feeding people who are actually grateful." Judy's face flushed deep red, and she opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, then opened it once more, as if the right words had gone on strike. Across from her, Lena was already leaning over the table, trying to calculate what she'd ordered, her fingers tapping nervously against her wine glass as she whispered to Tom about how much the crab cakes had cost. Around the table, the rest of the family began to stir uncomfortably, conversations shifting from casual to urgent as people tried to remember how many drinks they'd had and whether dessert had been worth it. The waiter, sensing the tension but unfazed by it, began gently asking each person for their individual order totals, pen poised above his notepad with mechanical grace. And that was when it truly hit them, not just the inconvenience, not just the awkwardness of splitting a check in a fine dining restaurant, but the realization that the financial safety net they had always assumed would be there had been quietly pulled out from beneath them. For the first time in years, they were feeling the weight of a bill they had grown too comfortable ignoring, and it showed in every furrowed brow, every muttered complaint, every sideways glance thrown in my direction. "You're humiliating this family," Judy hissed finally, the words bursting from her like steam from a kettle that had been whistling too long. Her voice was low but sharp, meant to wound, meant to claw back some semblance of control in a moment where none remained. But I didn't flinch. I didn't lower my gaze or apologize or try to smooth over the chaos like I always had before. Instead, I met her eyes with steady calm and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to explain. The humiliation wasn't mine to carry anymore. They'd built this narrative for years, painting me as the benefactor, the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong unless she was paying for her seat, and now they were finally being forced to live in the story they'd written. The silence that followed her accusation was different this time, not awkward or uncertain, but heavy with something much deeper. Recognition, maybe. Or regret. Or the faint echo of a truth that had been too long ignored. And as the waiter continued down the line, gathering card after card, I leaned back in my chair and let them stew in the discomfort they'd so effortlessly handed me for years. For the first time in a very long time, I felt the scales beginning to balance. For years, I had carried the unspoken weight of being the dependable one, the financial cushion, the reliable presence who kept everything running smoothly while others reaped the benefits without so much as acknowledging the cost. But in that moment, sitting across from my mother with the bill finally balanced right in front of her, I realized how unfamiliar they all were with the idea of accountability. Judy's face was a portrait of indignation, eyes narrowed, lips pursed in a way that would have once sent me scrambling to smooth things over, but not this time. This time, I was done patching cracks in a family foundation that had always been brittle beneath my feet. When she repeated her accusation, her voice sharp enough to pierce glass, "You're humiliating this family," I didn't flinch, didn't raise my voice or shift in my seat. I simply leaned forward slightly, rested my folded hands on the edge of the table, and said in the calmest tone I could muster, "No, Mom. I'm just showing this family how much it actually costs to have me around." The words didn't explode, didn't echo dramatically across the table, but the effect was immediate and electric. Judy blinked, taken aback not just by what I'd said, but by how I'd said it, with control, with grace, without apology. For a moment, no one spoke. The clatter of silverware and the low hum of the restaurant returned like background music, trying to fill the vacuum left by truth hanging in the air. And then, of course, Tom had to ruin it with his usual brand of belligerent self-importance, slamming his hand on the table with a theatrical flair that would have impressed a second-rate actor in a community play. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, turning toward me with a sneer. "You're ruining Thanksgiving over a few damn dollars. Is that what this is about? You want attention? Fine, take the spotlight." I tilted my head and offered him a smile so faint it almost wasn't there. "No, Tom," I said, voice steady as stone. "I don't want attention. I want fairness. And for the record, I've already paid for my meal and left a generous tip for the staff. What I'm no longer paying for is everyone else's entitlement." Lena's face turned pink, whether from embarrassment or frustration I couldn't tell, and she muttered something under her breath about family sticking together, but I didn't bother responding. I had spent too many years swallowing my words to keep the peace, too many dinners pretending that love and manipulation were somehow interchangeable, and I was finished translating abuse into affection just because it came with a side of cranberry sauce and seasonal centerpieces. The waiter returned quietly with the separate checks, placing each one neatly in front of the appropriate person. Some faces grew pale, others red with agitation, but I kept my eyes on my glass of water, swirling it gently, letting them all sit with the discomfort I had shouldered alone for far too long. And then, something unexpected happened. From across the table, my cousin Amanda reached out subtly, sliding a folded paper napkin toward me beneath her dessert spoon. I glanced down, and in faint, slanted handwriting were the words, "They always took you for granted. I see you." It was simple. It was small. But in a room full of performative outrage and crumbling pretenses, it felt like a beam of light cutting through a storm cloud. I looked up and met her eyes. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't seek acknowledgement, but her gaze was warm, and that was enough. It was the only sincere connection I'd felt at that table all evening. I knew, at that moment, there was nothing left here for me but noise and expectation and the persistent ache of trying to belong where I never truly had. So I stood up slowly, sliding my coat from the back of my chair, smoothing it over my shoulders without a single dramatic gesture. Judy said something I didn't catch, some last attempt to guilt me, maybe, or a final jab wrapped in concern, but I didn't pause to listen. "I hope the rest of your evening goes well," I said, calm and polite, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "And don't worry, I won't make the same mistake next year." I walked out without looking back, my footsteps light but certain, as if the weight I had always carried had been quietly left behind at that table, nestled somewhere between the empty wine glasses and half-eaten slices of pumpkin pie. And for the first time in years, I chose peace over tradition. The morning after Thanksgiving dawned colder than usual, the sky a dull, pale gray that hung low over the city like a heavy sheet pulled tight across the sky. But even in that overcast stillness, something inside me felt strangely light, as if a weight I hadn't realized I'd been dragging behind me for years had finally lifted without ceremony or fuss. I pulled on a thick sweater, laced up my boots, and drove across town to the small community shelter where I had arranged for the dinner fund to be donated. The same amount that had previously paid for filet mignon and overpriced desserts now sat in the kitchen's budget as warm food and full trays for people who needed it far more than my ungrateful relatives ever had. The shelter wasn't anything fancy, just a modest red brick building tucked behind a church, with faded linoleum floors and a smell of coffee that had been brewing since dawn. But it buzzed with a different kind of energy, one that didn't feel manufactured or conditional. Volunteers moved around with purpose, laughter mixing with the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation that rose like a heartbeat inside the space. No one was pretending here. No one was putting on a performance for appearances or twisting kindness into currency. As I stepped inside, someone handed me an apron without asking any questions, and I found myself standing behind a counter, serving mashed potatoes to strangers who looked me in the eye and said thank you like they meant it. Some were older, some younger, some barely able to hold their plates steady from the cold that had soaked into their bones, but every single one of them offered more genuine warmth than my family had in years. Between servings, I chatted with a woman named Marcia who told me she used to be a teacher until life knocked her sideways. Another man, Alan, said he'd worked construction for 30 years before a back injury left him jobless and invisible. None of them asked what I did or what kind of car I drove or whether I had someone waiting for me at home. They just shared pieces of themselves without expectation, and in return, I gave them the one thing I had always given too freely to people who never deserved it: my time, my care, my heart. For the first time in a long while, I felt something real, a connection not built on obligation, not tied to bloodlines or old guilt, but rooted in choice. I chose to be here. I chose to give. And this time, the giving didn't feel like a burden. Back at home, though, my phone had other ideas. The notifications started rolling in before I even took my coat off. The first few were from Lena, each message a mix of passive-aggressive disappointment and wide-eyed bewilderment. "You really blindsided everyone, you know," she wrote, followed by, "You didn't even give us a heads up," and then, "Mom's really upset. I hope you're happy." I didn't reply. I just sat on the edge of my couch, staring at the screen like it belonged to someone else, letting the digital bile wash over me without letting it sink in. Then came Tom's text, predictably blunt and unnecessarily cruel. "Hope your little charity stunt was worth the embarrassment," he wrote. "You just made a fool of everyone. Congrats." I laughed bitterly, not because it was funny, but because of how unsurprising it was, how predictable it always was with him, how easy it had become to expect nothing but anger from a man who had never once lifted a finger to contribute. And finally, as if saving the most cutting blow for last, came Judy's message. Just one line, short and cold and sharp enough to cut straight through my still-beating chest. "You embarrassed us. I hope it was worth it." I stared at that message for a long time, the words flickering on my screen like a reminder of every unspoken expectation, every moment I'd swallowed my truth just to keep them comfortable. I thought about how many times I'd paid for more than just meals, how I'd paid for peace, for silence, for the illusion of belonging, all while they whispered behind my back about how convenient it was to have me around. But this time, I didn't rush to explain myself. I didn't type out a carefully crafted response designed to justify my actions or soften their discomfort. I didn't try to make them feel better about the truth they'd spent years refusing to face. I simply pressed delete. No reply. No apology. No more emotional discounting. And for the first time in my life, it felt like freedom. It was a few weeks after Thanksgiving when the letter arrived, tucked neatly inside a cream-colored envelope with no return address, the kind of thing most people would overlook in a pile of junk mail. But something about the soft curve of the handwriting on the front caught my eye. I knew before I even opened it that it wasn't from my mother or Lena or anyone else clinging to the fractured remnants of that performance they still called a family. It was from Amanda, my cousin, the one who had slipped me that quiet message on the napkin while everyone else was still trying to calculate their entrees and salvage their dignity. Her letter was short but sincere, each word handwritten in soft blue ink, the lines slightly crooked like she'd written it in a moment of hurried honesty rather than careful preparation. She told me she was proud of me. She said the family had needed that wake-up call for years, but no one else had the courage to deliver it. She admitted that she had watched me sit quietly through so many dinners, watched me shoulder the weight of everyone's entitlement with grace, watched the thankless role I had been cast in without ever saying anything. And then she wrote something I would never forget, something that landed in my chest with the weight of both comfort and grief. They thought you were just the one who paid. But I always knew you were the one who stayed kind, stayed strong, stayed real. That matters more than they'll ever admit. I folded that letter and tucked it into the back of my journal, not because I needed the validation, but because some words deserve to be held on to, especially when they come from places you never expected warmth to reach. By the time Easter rolled around, another invitation arrived, this time in a digital format, a pastel-colored email with cursive fonts and a subject line that read, "Join us for family dinner. We've missed you." It came from Lena, but it was clearly scripted by my mother, the wording too polished and vague to have been hers alone. There was no apology, no mention of what had happened in November, no acknowledgement of the texts or the silence or the message I had deleted without fanfare. Just a cheery invitation, as if I might have forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a credit card with a heartbeat. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting my eyes scan the time, the address, the RSVP button at the bottom. And then, without hesitation, I clicked delete again. No reply. No explanation, just a quiet decision to preserve the peace I had finally earned. That Easter morning, instead of dressing up and pretending everything was fine over glazed ham and hollow conversation, I laced up my hiking boots and drove 2 hours north into the mountains, letting the winding roads pull me farther from the noise, farther from the weight of a history I no longer felt obligated to carry. The air was cool and crisp, the trees tall and unapologetically still, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but restorative, like a deep breath after years of holding your lungs hostage for the sake of others' comfort. I hiked for hours, letting the rhythm of my footsteps clear the static in my mind, letting the sound of birdsong and distant wind replace the echoes of old arguments and conditional love. I stopped by a lake halfway through, sat on a flat rock beneath a pine tree, and watched the water shimmer under the afternoon sun, its surface calm, unbothered, free. And for the first time, I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel out of place or left behind or excluded. I just felt like myself, whole, steady, quietly proud. On the way home, I drove past my childhood neighborhood almost out of habit, the roads so familiar I could navigate them blindfolded. I slowed as I approached the house I had once called home, the same one where I'd learned how to shrink myself to fit into spaces I was never truly welcomed in, the same one where I'd heard whispers of my shortcomings even as I handed over my love wrapped in effort and sacrifice. The porch looked the same, the shutters still chipped at the corners, the flower beds dutifully tended to by my mother's need for appearances, even if no one noticed the roots rotting underneath. I parked for just a moment, not to go in, not to knock, but just to sit with the memory of the little girl who used to stand on that porch, hoping for praise, aching to be seen, believing she had to earn her place at the table by giving more than she ever received. I thought about her, and I thought about me now, and I realized we weren't the same anymore. She still wanted an invitation. I didn't. Sometimes revenge doesn't look like shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it's just not picking up the check. Sometimes it's realizing you don't have to pay for love that should have been free all along. And sometimes peace doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a long walk, a quiet heart, and an empty chair you finally stop trying to fill.